Between the years of 58 and 50 BC, the Roman general Julius Caesar would famously embark on his Gallic Wars. Caesar was then just one of many citizen generals of the Roman Republic, but it was clear to many back in Rome that his exploits in Gaul were not just ones for the success of Rome, but to bring Caesar glory and power unique to the Roman people. Some of his political rivals declared his actions illegal and chalked his campaign up to genocide and not at all about conquest. Caesar, of course, refuted these claims, arguing that many of his actions were defensive in nature, designed to protect Rome from the roaming bands of barbarians. Worse still, he declared, Germanic tribes were also waging war against the Gallic tribes, pushing more and more of them beyond the Danube River and into official Roman territory. Caesar declared that if he could bring Gaul under Roman jurisdiction, the country would be much safer and stronger. We don't know exactly what was going on in Caesar's mind, but one thing we do know and can attest to is the campaign of horror he commenced. In those 8 years of campaign through Gaul and beyond, Caesar's legions killed over 1 million Celts and just about 450,000 Germani. They enslaved another million. Caesar entered a land that was mysterious and even magical to the Romans, but he would leave a lasting impression that set off a chain of events to create the greatest legend the English language has ever known, King Arthur. In the year 55 BC, smack in the middle of his Gallic campaign, Caesar's focus shifted toward the mysterious island in the Western Sea. To most Romans, Caesar was already in mysterious territories, lands that many believed were haunted and even filled with evil spirits. The Gauls, Germani, and the distant Britons were looked at by the Roman elites as simple barbarians, not worthy of mutual respect. That summer, having pushed a large confederation of Gallic tribes beyond the Rhine River, Caesar sent for ships so that he can cross the English Channel and become the first Roman general to lead troops into this foreign land. To put things into perspective, Caesar's ventures into Britannia were very reminiscent of when Spanish conquistadors under Christopher Columbus would sail to the Americas in the late 15th century. The Roman men, like their later Spanish descendants, would know very little about the land they were going to, and the cultures they faced could not be more different than the ones they knew back home. Unlike the later Spanish, the Romans were terrible sailors, and when Caesar left Gaul, he only had enough ships for 2 of his 8 legions, and he only had infantry units with him, as the ships with the cavalries were forced back to the Gaul side of the channel due to inclement weather. It was late summer, well past the start of campaign season, but Caesar was eager to make history. A sign that Caesar and his men were in a strange place that was going to cause them great difficulties came right away, as this was the sight Caesar and his men first saw when they reached the British Isles. They came across this towering wall of white chalk rock where it would be impossible for them to land. But even more worrying to the Roman soldiers was that there were scores of British tribesmen awaiting the Romans at the shore. Caesar demanded they sail east to land on a beach, and when he did, he was immediately faced with an attack by the cavalry on horseback and chariots, as well as missiled with javelins. The Roman soldiers, bewildered by these barbarian tribes on chariots, were first afraid to disembark. Then the eagle bearer of the 10th Legion jumped into the sea, proclaiming that he, at any rate, would do his duty. Unless they wished to see their eagle fall into the hands of the enemy, they must follow him. "Jump down," he said, "my fellow soldiers, unless you wish to betray your eagle to the enemy. I, at least, will do my duty to the Republic and to our general." When he said this, with a loud voice, he threw himself out of the ship and advanced the eagle against the enemy. Seeing and hearing this, the men leaped forth freely. Despite the intense fighting on the beach, Caesar and his men were able to hold firm as the Britons never faced heavy infantry before. Caesar stayed in Britain only a short time. Though brief, it was a violent affair, with Caesar taking constant combat and resolving to burn villages in order to terrorize the local populations into submissions. His ships were attacked, and he was forced to dedicate a significant amount of men to their repair. By September, with not much of gain, Caesar retreated to the beaches of Kent and sailed back to Gaul. Some historians characterize Caesar's first campaign into Britain as a failure, and even he was disappointed by the lack of wealth he found on the island. but he was hailed as a hero for his landing and reinforced to return the very next year. Caesar returned the next year at the start of campaign season with means to conquer the island. The information he gathered from his first trip, like how the Britons fought and how they were not united but fractured into small tribes, came in handy as he spent the time away to recruit friendly Gallic tribes, especially ones with great cavalries. He returned with 800 ships to carry 5 legions this time and another 2,000 cavalrymen, most of which were those allies from Gaul. Note that at this time, a Roman legion consisted of about 5,000 men. Cassivellaunus had been at war with most of the tribes in Britain before, having recently overthrown the king of the mighty Trinovantes tribe, and though they rested their fate and freedom onto him, their confederation was a fickle one, something Caesar would exploit. This time, though the Romans would not face immediate battle on the beach, they would spend the spring and summer in constant engagement with the enemy, pushing them deeper into the mainland. Cassivellaunus employed hit-and-run tactics on the Romans as they made their march. Although it was effective in slowing Caesar, he refused to be stopped. He left a legion behind to build a wall to protect his ships, and despite his heavy losses at times, Caesar employed the same terror tactics he used in his first campaign to break the will of the people. Caesar burned towns, stole food from villages, and slew populations at his will. And with all this seeming success, he still lacked food at times to press on. Caesar's luck changed when Cassivellaunus' previous reign of terror came back to bite him. At first, one tribe came over to the Roman camp and defected, then another, and then another, and then another. For peace and for an alliance with Rome to protect them from Cassivellaunus in the future, they gave Caesar hostages and food. They also gave him valuable information. They let Caesar know where Cassivellaunus' fort was deep inside the woods, along with the wealth and food he stored to help him prolong the war until winter. The seasons were changing fast, and Caesar took his chance. He trekked into the forest where Cassivellaunus and his men were hiding and engaged them. He sustained heavy losses, but eventually it was the Gallic horsemen who helped him defeat his enemies. With that victory, Caesar sailed back to Gaul before winter came. But as he wintered in Gaul, a barbarian conspiracy was brewing. When his armies captured one Gallic leader, the leader shouted something that sent chills through the witness in Roman spines. He shouted that he was a free man in a free country, and it was clear that no matter how much the Romans meant to conquer, the Gallic and Germanic tribes were bent on retaining their independence. The Isle of Britain would remain independent of Rome for another 100 years, and in that time, Rome itself would go through a revolution. In the year 50 BC, Caesar would drive Rome into civil war, one in which he would win. He would make himself dictator for life, essentially dissolving the power of the Republic. A few years later, in the year 44 BC, Caesar would be assassinated by members of the Senate. Rome would once again plunge into civil war, and from it, his nephew Octavian would become Rome's first emperor, titling himself Augustus. Rome had went from a country of iron to one of marble. Emperor Claudius would eventually conquer Britain once and for all, bringing it into the fold of the Roman Empire. A legendary British queen of this era would set in stone the identity that would become important to the people of King Arthur's time. She was a fearsome woman named Boudica, and in the year 61, this queen of the Iceni would gather a confederation to resist the Romans. Her husband, Prasutagus, previously entered a treaty with the Romans that stated that he would leave them half of his kingdom in his death, with the other half going to his wife and 2 daughters. When he did die, the Romans ignored her pleas for honoring the contract, and they punished her complaints by flogging her and raping her 2 daughters. Boudica attacked Roman settlements and British allies of Rome. She would face and defeat the Legio IX Hispania Legion, and would burn the Roman cities of Verulamium and Londinium, the capital of Roman Britain. Along the way, her and her followers would kill 80,000 Roman settlers and their British allies. The Roman general charged with ending the rebellion was Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. He would go to defeat Boudica's forces. It is said by the Roman historian of this era, Tacitus, that Boudica poisoned herself rather than be captured by the Romans. With the Romans having secured most of Britain, their relationship with the island would remain hostile for the duration of their occupation. Still, the Romans built great cities, some of which still exist to this day in some fashion. They imported luxuries like bathhouses, different spices, tons of coins to pay off hostile tribes, and did their best to pacify the island, but it was always to no avail. This was an occupation more than anything. In the year 122, Emperor Hadrian would put up a wall that stretched the length of the island to keep hostile tribes from attacking the Roman settlements in the south. 20 years later, in the year 142, another wall had to be built further north under the Emperor Antoninus Pius. In researching this subject, I recalled the problem put forth by historian Paul Cooper in his series Fall of Civilizations podcast. He calls it the British mistake. Being that the nation was always hostile to some degree to Roman occupation, Rome always stationed their Roman general in Britain with the largest armed forces in the empire. Sometimes, Rome would have up to 10 legions on the island. That worked out while the empire was experiencing peace, but it tempted the leading generals of Britain to seek the throne through war when times were bad. Beginning in the year 96, with the Emperor Nerva and ending with Marcus Aurelius in 180, Rome experienced a period of expansion and prosperity under what they call the Five Good Emperors. But this peace would soon come to an end. Aurelius' son, Commodus, was a terrible leader, and when he was assassinated by a gladiator in the year 192, Rome would begin a period known as the 3rd Century Crisis. Rome never really had a clear rule for royal succession, as Rome, prior to the rise of Augustus Caesar, was very against the rule of kings and emperors. Augustus himself never claimed to be the emperor, preferring the name the first citizen instead, but his successors would prove to be much more tyrannical than Rome ever imagined. The Julio-Claudian dynasty ended with the wicked Emperor Nero, who has gained fame in the Christian Bible for his persecution of those Christians and in secular historical commentary for his murderous ways and gluttony. Now entering the 3rd century, Rome would enter a new era, one where the empire of marble risks becoming one of rust. A man named Pertinax succeeded Commodus in the year of 193, a year that would become known as the Year of the Five Emperors. The reason for that name is because that year, 5 men from across the empire claimed the throne, with the 2 most successful in the wars being Septimius Severus and Clodius Albinus. Albinus was a Tunisian-born Roman who was afflicted with albinism at birth. He was a mighty soldier who had won respect of the British population, and now, with the seat of power of Rome vacant, he took all of his legions and made for Europe. He would eventually fall to Septimius Severus, and Severus would then sail to England to establish his presence and authority on the populations. Rome underestimated the work Clodius Albinus did to pacify Britain for a while, and things would only get worse for Rome as time passed. As Rome recovered from the 3rd century crisis, in the year 293, the Emperor Diocletian would divide the empire into 2. Rome then would be divided again into a tetrarchy, with 4 people ruling the empire at once. Time and time again, Roman generals would make Cooper's famous British mistake, but some would have more luck than others. In the year 306, a Roman general in Britain named Constantine was crowned emperor in York and took his legions back to Europe to take the crown. 6 years later, at Milvian Bridge in Rome, he defeated Maxentius and ended the tetrarchy, uniting his empire. This was seen as somewhat of a second golden age for Rome, and by his own testimony, Constantine claimed that he had a dream the night before the battle where he was to denote his allegiance to Christ by painting Christ's initials in Greek on the shields of his men in order to win the battle. And when he won the battle, he converted to Christianity, a religion once illegal in the Roman Empire, forever changing Rome and the entire world. The Christian faith was already present in the empire, but it began to grow stronger just as the empire in the West would continue to weaken, largely because the incursion of Germanic tribes into Roman territory driven there by a terror from the east. This terror was Attila and the Huns, and Romans began to bring tribes they once deemed barbarian into the fold for protection, but it began to backfire. At the turn of the 4th to the 5th century, the fate of the Western Empire began to turn for the worse. It was clear that their grip on Britain was failing, and in the year 367, it came to be, when a great barbarian conspiracy saw legions of Roman soldiers defect to the barbarian sides and allow armies to attack Roman fortifications and cities. The terror was reminiscent of what happened when Rome's cities in Britain were attacked by Boudicca some 300 years earlier. Rome came to understand from this that the world around them was changing, and the bands of barbarians were forming their own diplomatic allegiances, ones that, if they were to band together, could defeat Rome. This is where the story of Arthur begins and the story of the Roman Britons ends. From here, we will begin to walk the thin line between mythology and history that this series was designed to flirt with. With the death of Emperor Theodosius in 395 AD, he divided the empire between his two sons, Arcadius, who became Emperor of the East, and Honorius, who became Emperor of the West. Because Honorius was so young, a general named Stilco commanded his government and armies. In 402, with the Visigoths and Ostrogoths attacking Roman lands and threatening Italy, Stilco pulled troops from Hadrian's Wall and began a process of ending Roman occupation in Britain. By the year 407, there were just a few Roman soldiers left on the island, and with the constant stream of bad news about Germanic incursions in the East and Western empires, the soldiers garrisoned in Britain channeled the energy that helped restore Roman might just a century before. Amongst those remaining Romans was a common soldier who just so happened to be named Constantine. Albeit there were officers and commanders present, he was chosen through election as Emperor of Rome and King of Britain. To understand how ridiculous this must have seemed when the news reached Honorius, now a young man, it would be like if, in a century from now, Americans choose for a leader to command the nation, a private in the army named George Washington. This new Constantine was and still a mystery. Historians took little care in his time to record anything about his past before he was declared emperor, or even record the names of his two living sons before they took on regal ones, but they did manage to record that he was gluttonous and was unprepared to lead. Either way, Honorius felt the need to honor Constantine's title and share the throne with him for a while. Back in Rome, Honorius and Stilco were in conflict with the Eastern Roman Empire and could not focus on defeating Constantine. Being in Britain for over 6 years with no pay, Constantine and 6,000 of his soldiers sailed to Gaul and staked his claim as the Emperor of Rome. Honorius would eventually appoint a new general named Flavius Constantius, and he would defeat Constantine III and present his head to Honorius on September 18th, 411 AD. This was the last Roman presence in Britain. Famously, in the year 476, Rome itself would fall, and the Roman Britain would begin to fall apart. The great cities with markets, baths, stadiums for games, and all the amenities of urbanizations left behind began to decay, and in this decay, a legend began to brew. Western Europe went into a period called the Dark Ages. This was a time where the administration that Rome was famed for crumbled, and literacy across the former empire began to falter back to a period of oral history and legends. The last century of Rome was one where Christianity spread, and as it made its way onto the Isle of Britain, Christian monks converted former Celtic druids, and they helped to maintain some form of literacy in the period of the Dark Ages. The writings of St. Patrick and Gildas, two men living around the end of the fall of Roman Britain, helped maintain an early history of Dark Age Britain and the challenges the people face. It must be understood that despite the resistance of Britons throughout the Roman occupation of the island, Roman culture had become intertwined with the Brits, and even the enemies of the Romans grew to profit off their occupation, demanding ransom at times in order to allow for peace to maintain. The Latin script was largely adopted, and even when Roman occupation ended, there was a sizable Roman elite that remained and lived in relative peace, repurposing Roman forts into personal castles to defend their families and lands. But new threats began to arrive in Britain in the form of two groups known as the Anglos and Saxons. These Romano-Britons and Celts resisted the expansion of the Anglo-Saxons, so the quest to find a king to unite all of the Britons began, and the Britons remembered that last Constantine, the commoner turned king, who was a product of the empire of stability known as Rome, and they conjured up that he had two sons with local British women, two sons who would come back to save Britain from these new foreigners who were establishing kingdoms in the east of the island, pushing the Britons further into the west. These two sons were Aurelius Ambrosius and Uther Pendragon, the father of the famed King Arthur. So now that we have set up the story, it's time to finally get to know Arthur. Was he real? Was he fake? And does it even matter? Well, before we dive into the work of the historians of his period and the decades and century after Arthur and even modern historians, I will attempt to tell you the birth, rise, and fall of King Arthur, according to legend.